personally am really excited to hear this story because it's not really ever been told before that I know of. How many of you have heard of the company Honey? How many of you have heard anything about the company Honey as separate from coupon codes, maybe an advertisement on Facebook? Cool, like 2, 3 of you, right? It's not a story that's been told. Glenn Allison is the chief culture officer, or the chief operating officer at Honey. He's probably also the chief culture officer, but he could talk about that. Where his main responsibility over the last 3 years has been scaling this company while focusing on creating a culture of excellence. He comes from a really interesting background, which I hope he's going to talk about a little bit. He was previously at Twitter, heading up their enterprise relations on data. He has founded a couple of companies of his own, and over the last 20 years, he's shipped software for Microsoft, Palm, Good Technology, Sprint, and even America Online. So can we get a round of applause for Glenn Allison of Honey?
Thanks, Robin. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are we? It's always fun to be the first person after a coffee break, but I'll do my best to keep the momentum going this morning. So, Robin, thanks for the warm introduction, and thanks to everybody from Responsive for getting everything pulled together to make this an eventful day. Yes, we're going to move forward. Pulling it into the spotlight. So, today we're going to talk about core values and how important that is to your company's culture. And I know, hey, we're in Las Vegas. No better place to talk about core values than in Las Vegas. But actually, I was really inspired yesterday listening to John Bunch from Zappos and understanding how important it is to the culture of the building that we're in right now and how it's really shaped and informed the success of their product. So how do we talk about that with annual goals? I know as your company, you're thinking, my employees are just clamoring for one more form to fill out as they get through their workday, right? It's just something else they can put on top of what they're trying to do. But it is really critical as you start thinking about your company's success and how you really put that in front of them to make it a tool for their own personal growth. As Robin mentioned, I've had the pleasure of working at these great brands and companies over the last 25 years. And I know you're saying, how could that 24-year-old kid on stage have been working 25 years? But I've always looked at the goal setting process at working at even these great companies as something that wasn't about me. It never seemed to be about my personal development or my personal growth. It seemed to be a check mark for the company or a tool the company used to assess performance, or even worse yet, use the annual goal setting as a benchmarking against other employees. So that didn't feel right to me. It felt like, hey, we should really be talking about my growth, not measuring me against my coworkers or using it as a compensation tool. So when I had the pleasure of joining Honey, the company was just a handful of people in a room. They certainly didn't have a goal-setting process. They had some core values, but they didn't have them written down. And that was really the most important thing that we orchestrated during the days of being at the office at Honey was write down who we are as a company. If we expect to be growing and scaling at the pace that we've said to our investors, we really need a true north. We really need a way for our folks to be able to measure how they're doing and go back to making their decision process time and time again. And let's do that against the core values. So we wrote them down, and this was 3.5 years ago. And we've had to make some iterations on them, but they've been very slight, and we've been very fortunate to have that. So our 7 core values are the ones you see on screen here. Seek the core principles, do the right thing, think clever, build things that make you proud, make everyone around you better, own the outcome, and grow without limit. So you'll hear me say these a little bit throughout the presentation and referencing them and about how we put that into the process. So again, because we seek the core principle, we're like, great, we're growing as a company. Our employees need a way to set their goals. How do we do that? So let's look at and question why as you talk through the annual goal setting process. And this is really the way it works at most companies, or at least in my experience, how things have trickled down, right? You have a board that meets every couple months, and they get about 2 hours of attention. Some boards are more involved, and some boards spend more time throughout the quarter, but a lot just meet once a quarter to hear about your business. They set some random OKRs, and then those OKRs trickle down to the executives that say, hey, I have to keep the board happy. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go tell my management team how to go get that done. And then the management goes and tells the staff, here's what your goals are for the year. So again, referencing back to Honey's core values, we thought, how do you grow without limit? If you look at the traditional process, this is inherently limiting. This isn't something that we really wanted to do. So we also thought to ourselves, let's see if we can because we're a startup, let's see if we can do things differently. So let's flip that upside down a little bit. Let's try this out, and let our staff decide who they wanted to become, right? What made them better employees? How did they really want to start to grow themselves? So we let our staff start to write their own annual goals, and we started giving them a little bit of defining principles against making that happen. That's tough, right? Like, it's not what people are used to doing. So what does that look like? Well, you really do have to examine, what are the values for your company? Are they the right ones where your employees can sit down, reference them, and actually utilize them? Can you operationalize your core values? And that's something that it took a lot of work on our part to do, is write those values so actually people could think through them and systematically go down a list and say, if I did these things in the context of my job function, would that make me a better person, right? If you have a better person, that should translate into having a better employee, which should translate into better company goals. So giving the folks the freedom to do that comes with a little bit of overhead in the last line here, which is coaching and mentoring. So what we decided to do with the company was invest in that, right? We hired executive leadership to come in and build an L&D department out. We put in something called manager cohorts, where the executive team actually sits down with new managers and gives them real world mentorship, where they can facilitate conversation, where they can really talk through what it's like in the battlefield, so to speak, right? That takes a lot of investment, though. So it sounds easy. And again, that's the investment part of it. But as startups go and as boards meet and as companies get more successful, they raise more money, and most of the money goes into growth. And when I say growth, that's traditional growth marketing usually, right? That's user acquisition. That's things like make the company go faster. What a lot of companies don't do is think about growth for their current employees. We all spend an awful lot of money recruiting and bringing in talent to organizations, but we don't spend as much trying to grow the people that we already have there. Sometimes they're left and sort of forgotten about. And I think that's why it's so great that we have conferences like this to continue to push and drive and make people think about that. So at Honey, we were very fortunate. And in retrospect, we can say that. But in the early days, we couldn't raise any money, right? The company bootstrapped itself. We didn't have two nickels to rub together. And we had the ability to define the company we wanted. We were fortunate enough to get successful and become profitable before we took any investor money. So when you do that, you get to write some term sheets that are really advantageous to you as a company. So you don't have to actually listen to the board that comes with these traditional thought processes. You can say, no, we're building the company we want to build. So really pushing through that is an important benchmark for your company. So thinking through, how do you take control back over what your company is developing to be? And it really does. It always focuses back down onto the employees. So, and we've all been through this, right? The retention acquisition cost is high. Just like changing the oil in your car. If you don't do it, the engine's going to break down. It's not something that's really visible to you in the process, and you think that, wow, my car's performing better because I changed the oil. But over the course of time, it can break down. Last year alone, $160 billion in company costs for employee turnover. And that's just in the US alone. That's a remarkable amount of money that gets spent. If you think about how you could reinvest that within the company itself, helping set clear values for your employees so they could feel like they're actually growing, is something that pays itself back time and time again. I think we've all heard the old quote where the CFO says to the CEO, well, what if we invest in our employees and they leave? And then the CEO says, well, what if we don't and they stay? Right? Like, it's such a true statement. As a former engineer, we used to do something called paying down technical debt, right? That just means you build a lot of features and all of a sudden you're like, wow, our system can no longer support this many features with this many users. So we have to actually stop doing new stuff and we have to invest in our technology so that it can grow. So I like to say, if you're going to invest in technical debt, you should also invest in people debt, right? You should also look back at your organization and take some time and say, are our people working to grow themselves? Or are we just chasing some arbitrary OKRs that some random group of people have set for us? So putting that into play is really, it takes a lot of discipline. So what can you do with that? Take a look at your core values, iterate on them. They don't have to stay static. They can be something that you can operationalize, that you can make a system that becomes a perk for the company. Trust me, growth is the perk that all of your employees want. Every company has a barista, right? But they don't have a system in place that makes their employees better. So really put that into play where the core values becomes a big part of that. It's really helpful if your recruiting team mirrors that. Raise of hands, anybody have a culture fit interview within their company? Like somebody's got a slot during the interview? right? We used to have that as well. And we used to think, okay, culture fit, great. I'd grab a beer with that person, and that's the culture interview. What it really boils down to is that your core values interview. Does this person match up? And your recruiters can actually take care of that for you. It saves a lot of time with engineer phone calls and product manager phone calls if your recruiting team operationalizes your core values in the screening calls. And then challenge your team. Let them be afraid to fail. And it's a little bit difficult. As they write down their annual goals, make them map to the core values and then say, it's okay if you fail. Like, try to get better, learn from that failure, right? We like to say at Honey, we make tons of mistakes. We just hope they're all unique, right? We don't want to do that again. So with all that, you just have to have the flexibility to iterate on all of that. So what I would leave you with in closing is saying, when you invest in your people to become the best versions of themselves, you invest in your company to become the best version of itself. And that's what I've got for you today. Thank you. Thanks.